With so much conflicting advice around health and nutrition out there, how can you possibly know the truth? How do you know which sources of information you can trust and which ones have more fiction than fact about them? And what about scientific evidence, studies that seem to go against the grain and contradict the prevailing wisdom? In this video, I'm going to help you make sense of this by giving you a tool that will help you evaluate different sources of scientific evidence when it comes to health, medical, and in particular nutritional research. I'm going to walk you through the hierarchy of evidence. This is something that you can use to help evaluate how trustworthy a particular news outlet or a study or a particular piece of research is. As we'll see, not all studies are created equal, and some are more trustworthy than others. With this understanding in place, you'll be better able to comprehend the totality of scientific evidence and make more informed choices for your own health and that of your family. So let's dive in, friend. I'm Dr. Ryan Williams, your host and the founder of Growing Pure, where I help you achieve health and vitality through delicious vegan food. Now imagine a digital photograph. A single study, a single piece of research is a little bit like one pixel within that photograph. It's a very useful data point and it makes up part of the big picture, but in isolation it can't ever let you see the big picture. If you focus too narrowly on one particular study or one particular form of evidence, you risk not seeing the big picture and coming away with incomplete or even incorrect information that could be damaging to your health. But if you zoom out, you're able to put each piece of evidence into its proper context within the wider body of research, and you're able to see the big picture. So how do we know if we're looking at an individual pixel or the big picture? Well, the hierarchy of evidence really helps. Let me show you what I mean. We can draw out the hierarchy of evidence as a sort of pyramid. The pyramid is divided into layers representing different forms of evidence. And generally, as we move up the pyramid, the quality of that evidence is going to increase. The downside is that the size of each layer is kind of representing how much of that sort of evidence there is. So there tends to be a lot more evidence that is of lower quality than there is high quality evidence. The other point to mention here is that as we come down the pyramid, the risk of bias is going to increase. At these lower tiers of evidence, we're more likely to have influence or preconceived notions affecting the results that we get. So it's worth pointing out that all of these evidence sources that I'm going to be sharing with you are valuable. There's none that you can just sort of throw out and say are totally worthless. However, as we move up the hierarchy, we do tend to find that the quality and the trustworthiness of that source of evidence increases if we're looking to try and find the truth. So let's start at the bottom layer of our pyramid. This is going to be expert opinions. In the context of a scientific journal, this might also be an editorial. So this is exactly what it sounds like. It's the opinion of someone who is an expert in this field. But even within each class of evidence, and certainly within expert opinion, there is a wide variety of quality sources, right? So imagine you are talking to someone that's been in a particular field for 50 years. They've seen all different types of evidence. They've probably done a bunch of their studies themselves if they are scientists. So their opinion is going to carry a lot of weight. Certainly compared to someone that's read a few blog articles and is posting their half-baked opinions on Twitter or something, right?
I'm not stupid. I'm smart.
But nonetheless, this is still just an opinion. So this is why it becomes here at the bottom of the hierarchy. So let's move on to the next layer of our hierarchy. And this is going to be mechanistic, in vitro, and animal studies. There is some debate over exactly where different forms of evidence fall within this hierarchy, but I'm giving you sort of the generally agreed upon one. So what is this kind of evidence? Mechanistic data is sort of biochemical data. It's where we look in a lab setting, in a petri dish or a test tube, and we try and understand at a sort of molecular or cellular level what is happening. That's what in vitro means, sort of in a test tube. The really powerful thing about this form of evidence is that it gives us a sort of rationale to put into context some of the other forms of evidence that we're going to see. Additionally, I would tend to put in the context of sort of nutrition and health animal studies here as well. At the risk of stating the obvious, a rat is not a human. So you might do a study on a rat and find some data, but that may not correlate very well with what happens in humans. However, animal studies can be very helpful. I'm not talking about the ethical side of it here, but in terms of finding out what could happen to a living organism in response to some kind of external stimulus, they do give us helpful information. So let me give you an example of some kind of a mechanistic study. Let's say you were investigating the health effects of uranium, right? So you could get some human cells in a petri dish and put them next to some uranium rock. And you would likely see that those cells start to be destroyed by the radiation coming off that uranium. And so you may very well extrapolate from that and say, if uranium is able to kill human cells in a petri dish, it's probably not going to be very good for a living, breathing human. But that may not always be the case. That is always an extrapolation. And so you might have a good reason to believe that what happens in a test tube is also going to happen to a real human, but that isn't always the case. And so that's why this kind of mechanistic level data comes reasonably low down in the hierarchy. The next type of evidence then is going to be a case report. So a case report is generally an instance of one person that comes to the attention of a health professional or a scientist that is showing some kind of symptoms that may be of interest. So this isn't a trial, this hasn't been intentionally done, but it's just something that's been observed in a case of one person. So in this case, this has actually happened to a person, and it's not just in a test tube, which is why it tends to go a little bit higher in the hierarchy of evidence. But still, this isn't really a study, it's just, oh, this has happened. And so usually case reports are used as the basis for further studies, because with the case of only one person, it's hard to really find much meaning from that. But still, they can be very, very helpful. And one case report that springs to mind is a woman, a vegan woman that had kidney stones, I believe it was. And this is generally not that common. Usually when people have a vegan diet, they tend to have a less incidence of kidney stones. But in this particular instance, it turned out this woman had been living off pretty much just spinach smoothies for like the last month. And so when that's pretty much all she'd been eating, it seemed to make sense that perhaps that could lead to some strange problems given such an extreme and unusual diet. So that's an example of a case report. Next, let's go on to our true sort of observational epidemiological studies. The first type here is going to be a cross-sectional study. And the next layer up is going to be what's called a case control study. All right, so what is a cross-sectional study? This is when we look at a population and we take a cross-section of it, a snapshot in time, and we try and understand how a particular variable of interest, say a particular disease, is prevalent or occurs within a given population, given other variables that we might be interested in. So let's say we're investigating lung cancer, for instance. We might look at a population, try and see who has lung cancer at a greater rate and try and correlate that to other variables. A case control study is similar, but there's a fundamental difference. Rather than just looking at one population, we're going to be looking at two separate ones. One that has the sort of thing we're studying and one that doesn't. So in this lung cancer example, we would look at a group of people that all have lung cancer and then a group of people that don't have lung cancer, trying to keep everything else equal as much as possible and try and understand what is different about these people. Now, these observational studies can be incredibly useful. They can provide really good data that allows us to understand a topic much better. For instance, with that lung cancer example, we see from observational studies that the incidence of lung cancer is about 15 times greater amongst smokers compared to those who have never smoked. Or to give you another example, we see that the incidence of brain damage of what's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, essentially brain damage, is much, much higher in those people that play contact sports like boxing, American football, and rugby. And this is, of course, because in those sports you're likely to get repeated blows to the head. Now, these kinds of studies give us excellent data correlating different variables. But as is often said, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. So just because two things happen at the same time doesn't necessarily mean one is causing the other. So in the two examples I've just given, we might notice that people who have lung cancer own a lot more ashtrays than people that don't. And so we might surmise, well, maybe owning ashtrays causes lung cancer. Common sense tells you it's not owning the ashtrays, it's the smoking, right? Or we might notice that boxers and American football players go to the gym a lot more than people that don't. And so we might think, well, if all these people going to the gym are getting brain damage, maybe going to the gym causes brain damage. Common sense again tells you that it's very unlikely to be going to the gym, right? And so this is why understanding the totality of evidence is so critical. We need to put a particular study into context, right? In particular, it can be very helpful to have a plausible mechanism, right? So what would be the mechanism of owning ashtrays causing lung cancer? There isn't really one. Whereas we do have mechanistic information that shows that tobacco smoke can cause tumor formation in cells in a petri dish. So you've got a plausible mechanism there. And so this understanding of the wider body of evidence allows us to tease out whether the correlation is genuine causation or whether it's just a coincidence. And perhaps the most insidious problem that can come from observational studies is inferring reverse causation. We actually get it the wrong way round. Rather than the truth being A causes B, from observational studies we might think, well, maybe B causes A. So let me give you an example here. A 2014 study from a research team in Austria seemed to find from an observational study that vegetarians had a 50% increased risk of heart attacks and a 50% increased risk of cancer compared to the general population. Now, at this point, alarm bells should probably be ringing because literally thousands of other studies find precisely the opposite conclusion to be true. They find that being vegetarian lowers your cancer and heart disease risk. So how could this study come to such a wildly different conclusion? Well, it turns out there were numerous problems and pitfalls with this study that really highlight the issues you can have with observational studies. Firstly, only 0.2% of the study participants were vegetarian, compared to 99.8% that weren't. And so with this vast difference in the numbers, they weren't able to conduct a proper statistical analysis. So they didn't know for sure whether it was just random chance that gave them this outcome. Secondly, there was only one single telephone interview that was conducted with the study participants to figure out their health status and their dietary habits. And whilst a telephone interview could be a good way of getting data, obviously it's not done very well. You can imagine that there could be all kinds of problems. Thirdly, the actual food that the vegetarians were eating was never assessed. They weren't actually asked what they were eating. So for all we know, these vegetarians were subsisting off French fries and Coca-Cola every day, right? I think we would all agree that that's not a healthy diet, but we don't actually know what these people were eating. But perhaps the most egregious problem with this study was that the vegetarians were not asked how long they'd been vegetarian or what prompted them to turn vegetarian. So someone that had been eating steak and eggs every day for their entire lives and the day before this study started became vegetarian would have been counted as a vegetarian in this study. Obviously that doesn't make sense and isn't good science. And the other thing is, it's not uncommon for people to make quite drastic changes to their lifestyle, like turning vegetarian, when they are diagnosed with a serious health condition like heart disease or cancer. So for all we know, the vegetarians in this study may have become vegetarian because they got a diagnosis of heart disease or cancer. It may have even been on the advice of their health professionals. And yet this study reported it as vegetarians get more cancer and heart disease. So how do you get around these potential issues in these observational studies? Well, one way is you just design the study better, right? In that 2014 study example, you would ask the vegetarians how long they've been vegetarian, why they became vegetarian, you'd actually find out what they're eating, you'd recruit a decent number into the study, all that kind of thing. But the other major factor that allows us to tease out that causation is time, which brings us on to cohort or prospective studies. So a cohort study is so named because you take a group of people, a population, and you follow them over time. And you try and investigate what happens to them in terms of whatever variables you're looking at, whatever health outcomes you're looking at, and try and correlate that with, for example, their diet or whether they smoke or not, and that sort of thing. So following a population over time certainly doesn't completely eliminate these problems, but it really does help us know whether we're looking at genuine causation or not. And with regards to the field of nutritional research, of nutritional epidemiology, there have been a handful of really big, excellent cohort studies. For example, the EPIC study, which is a European study looking at diet and cancer. We've got the Nurses Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. These are both out of Harvard University. Excellent studies. Also the Adventist Health Study, which has, these studies have looked at the population of Seventh-day Adventists living in California. And so these studies have followed tens or sometimes hundreds of thousands of people over many years, sometimes decades, and have been able to give us a lot more information on what dietary factors cause health outcomes. And so you can easily see how these kinds of studies, which all point to people eating more plants get less cancer and heart disease, are a lot more trustworthy than a single cross-sectional study. So these are our observational studies. This brings us on then to our interventional studies, where a change is actively made. And this is going to be our randomized controlled trials, RCTs. So let's break this down. A trial is something where we're going to be actively making a change. It's randomized because we've got a group of volunteers, a group of participants, and we've randomly assigned them either to have the intervention or to not have it, to be in the control group, which brings us on to the controlled part. To understand the effects of a particular variable, we need to have a control group. So in a randomized control trial, let's say you're testing a new drug, for instance, and you want to know how well this works. You would take a group of people, randomly assign them to either have the drug or to not have it, to just have an identical looking pill that's just a sugar pill. And you'll then be able to see what happens to the people that are taking the drug and what happens to those that aren't taking it. And ideally, you'd keep everything else about these two groups the same. You're only aiming to change that one variable so you can be sure that that one variable that you have changed is causing the outcomes. And ideally, a randomized control trial will get around potential confounding variables that might be an issue in observational studies. So, for instance, you might see that vegetarians have better health outcomes than meat eaters. But then maybe vegetarians also exercise more, or they get more sleep each night, or they don't smoke as much as meat eaters. So how do you know whether it's the diet or the smoking or the sleep? It's hard to do that. There are statistical tools that help you adjust for those things, but a randomized control trial is a really good way of just changing one thing and finding out exactly what that one variable does. So you might ask yourself, why not just do randomized controlled trials then? Why bother with any of the rest of this? Well, firstly, they can still be subject to bias. They can be poorly designed and you can get bad results out. But the other major problem, especially when it comes to nutritional research, is that health outcomes that matter to us, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, stroke, obesity, these take decades to develop. You can't really do a randomized controlled trial that lasts for decades. Try getting someone, putting them in a lab and saying, for the next 30 years, we're going to decide exactly what you're going to eat, and you're going to eat a vegan diet, and we're going to monitor you for that whole time. It's not possible. You can't do it, right? So in many instances, you may not be able to do a randomized controlled trial, so you have to rely on other forms of evidence. However, it is worth saying that for drugs and for surgical interventions, randomized controlled trials are excellent. These you can do, a few weeks, couple of months. That's a reasonable time frame to test a drug or a surgical intervention. And so we finally come to the top layer of our pyramid. This is going to be meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So what are meta-analyses and systematic reviews? Essentially, they're going to take a bunch of this other data and compile it all together. They're normally going to take randomized controlled trials or observational studies, and they're going to try and pull them all together, lots of individual studies, and tease out the broader pattern amongst them. And meta-analyses in particular are very, very helpful because they allow us to do advanced statistical analysis on the pooled data from lots of individual studies. And so ideally, what this will do is give us a lot more trust in the answers that we're getting out and make us think that that answer is likely to be very close to the truth. So let's say, for example, you did a meta-analysis looking at whether meat causes colon cancer. And you did 20 different studies in there. You might find 2 studies that show meat has no effect on colon cancer. And then the other 18 studies show that there is a correlation, an association between eating more meat and more colon cancer risk. At this point, you'll be able to see that the broad pattern is strongly suggesting meat is related to colon cancer and is probably causative. So for this reason, because they're compiling lots of different studies, meta-analyses and systematic reviews are generally seen as the most reliable, highest quality form of evidence. But you do still have to be cautious because they can be misleading, right? A meta-analysis is only going to be as good as the studies that went into it. If the studies that you're analysing are poorly done, they're junk, then you'll get junk out, right? So to give you a slightly facetious example, let's say we were doing a meta-analysis on the shape of the Earth. You might see that the vast majority of studies that have been performed on this suggest that the Earth is roughly spherical in shape. But you might come across a few studies that suggest the Earth is totally flat. So maybe your meta-analysis result would compile all of these different studies and come out with the answer that the Earth is sort of dome-shaped. Okay, obviously this is not the case. The Earth is roughly spherical shaped, even if there are other studies that say it isn't. And that's why no single source of evidence can be seen as the be-all and end-all. If a meta-analysis or a systematic review gives us results that make no sense in the wider context, in the wider body of evidence, if there are no plausible mechanisms for it and observational studies don't agree with it, then we should really be questioning the results it's giving us. Now, there is one other point that I'd like to mention that can seriously affect the trustworthiness of any of these sources of evidence. And that is that money corrupts, right? When industry provides funding for a study, it's very, very rare that that study will find results that throw the products that that industry creates into a negative light. They'll generally always find favorable or at the very least neutral results. You know, the scientists that perform these studies are human as well, right? They're not immune to influence. And if they're being paid by industry to perform a study, there's kind of an implicit assumption that they want a good result that helps them sell more product. And scientists know that their careers, their livelihoods, their ability to pay the bills depends on them continually getting more funding, more money. And so they're unlikely to take that risk by publishing findings that slam the industry that's funding them, right? They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. So you really have to look carefully at the funding sources for any of these. Even meta-analyses and systematic reviews could easily be industry funded and will come up with questionable results sometimes. So there we have it. That is the hierarchy of evidence. I hope this has really helped you to properly evaluate different forms of evidence and give them the proper weighting in terms of how trustworthy and how impactful they are. And the next time you are at a family dinner and your great uncle Gerald is spouting his opinions on eating lard every day is the cornerstone of good health, you'll know where to place his opinions within the hierarchy of evidence. So my hope is that now you are much better armed to critically evaluate the information that you come across when it comes to health and nutritional research. Now, as a thank you for being here with me today and sharing your precious time with me, I'd like to offer you a gift. This is my summary of the top 5 principles of health. These are the simplest steps that we could all be taking to have the biggest positive impact on our health. If this would be helpful to you, please click on the link in the description below. It's my free gift to you. And if you've enjoyed this video, then I think you will also get a lot of value from my review of the book Whole, Rethinking the Science of Nutrition by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. If you would like to watch that video, you can click right here to do that. I want to thank you so much for watching, friend, and I'll see you in the next video.